Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the ranch. That's right, I bought more land, and I invested in some conspiracy cattle. Cattle which will soon be mutilated, because we're talking about those pesky aliens again. In this volume, we'll talk a bit more about the context of these supposed interviews, or more accurately, interrogations. What did we find out? The deep state thought it was on the verge of some technological discovery, but instead, it was taught a surprising lesson about the power of the mind, and the power of some very, very old technology. And I believe this discovery sent the entire intelligence community into a tailspin, a downward spiral of paranoia and illegal experimentation on American citizens. I don't want to insult our new overlords, so let's use the politically correct term, non-human intelligence, or NHI for short.
Apology. Now. Human.
Now, in Volume 1, we talked about where the NHI come from, and we made fun of their wardrobe choices. And I want to go on record now saying that I regret that.
Satisfactory. For now.
We ended our last episode of this series discussing hypotheses about where the NHI come from. I think we gave that topic about as much attention as it deserves given how little information we have. I mentioned in the last episode that our leaker did not have any information about propulsion systems. He says that the deep state is going to hold on to that very, very lucrative information as long as they possibly can. And this farm has been very busy developing new strains of conspiracies, new seed stock, and I do think there is some indication that the intelligence community may have intervened, interfered, or otherwise guided the scientific process. I am starting to suspect that some of the movements in physics in the late 20th century may have been a response to the intelligence community, or may have actually been pushed by the intelligence community to make sure that ordinary civilian humans don't wander into some sort of extremely powerful technology without the proper government assistance and oversight, of course. This has a definite paper trail. When the Soviets detonated their H-bomb in 1952, thus erasing all of the careful and expensive preparations for secrecy that the Defense Department made in 1942 when they began working on the atomic bomb. All of that lead time had just been erased, had just evaporated along with the test scaffold of the Russians' H-bomb. And so in 1953 and 1954, there was a flurry of regulations and legislation involving secret technologies and the regulation of technology, testing, and materials related to nuclear power. And nuclear power was defined by objects that emitted radiation, or weapons or power sources that involved the same types of materials. And the beauty of that is, NHI materials are, in some cases, radioactive. Now, in some cases, they're not. What's funny is apparently part of the fuel that is used for NHI propulsion is element 151. It's now called muscovium. When Bob Lazar first talked about it in 1989, it was purely theoretical, and people thought it was hilarious, especially since they said that he had put a piece of it in his pocket, and he said that it wasn't radioactive at all, and that's why he was able to sneak it out of Area 51. Of course, when humans synthesized muscovium, or element 151, in the 2000s, I believe, it is extremely radioactive and decays in milliseconds. However, Bob Lazar maintains that the NHI are able to sort of 3D print a metastatically stable isotope of element 151 that is not radioactive at all. Apparently, the artificial synthesis of these kinds of super heavy elements in configurations that have in their nuclei configurations of protons and neutrons that are uniquely stable and do not cause radioactive decay is an essential part of developing electrogravitic propulsion. So, of course, our leaker did not talk about element 151 at all. He did apparently receive information about just the sheer volume of NHI-related objects and vehicles that are in our general proximity. In this next clip, he talks about material floating around the Earth that NASA no doubt has some knowledge about. Let's listen.
There are hundreds of objects in orbit that are likely created by this intelligence. At first glance, they look like commonplace space debris. But on rare occasions, they will move in a way that is not attributable to gravity, meet with another object, or expel an object. Tracking these is very difficult, and we know very little about them, including their size.
So we know that NASA carries water for the military-industrial complex. This has been the case ever since the early 1960s. Now, I do think there is some extreme compartmentalization going on here, so that NASA does not have scientists currently working on Mars hand in hand with aliens for the betterment of mankind. I do think that an organization that devoted itself to large, dangerous, expensive, non-reusable chemical rockets to get to the moon, when it was well known that anti-gravitic technology existed, that's an indication that they may have been in the dark about certain recent developments in technology. Also, bear in mind that NASA and the space race, and the race to the moon in particular, was the brainchild of John F. Kennedy, who was probably the first major adversary of the deep state. And we all know how that ended. He fought the deep state, and he lost. But he was very concerned about what he knew about NHI and their vehicles and their occasional interference in human experiments. And he'd also heard similar concerns from the Soviet side. And so when Kennedy was pushing for space exploration, he was also pushing the intelligence community for more information about NHI and what's zipping around in the atmosphere. And we all know that the term UFO was invented by the United States Air Force. In the last couple of decades, NASA and the Defense Department have used the term UAP, which originally stood for Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. Now, that leaves room for all kinds of interpretation. That's a pretty broad range of things to call UAP. Strange cloud formations, ball lightning. All of those things could serve as UAPs if you wanted them to. There are videos on YouTube of space debris making strange changes in velocity, right-angle turns directly out of orbit, headed down to Earth in a straight line, is not usually something you see in natural objects. The live feed on the International Space Station has been a problem. It goes out often. You can check on that yourself. And we all know that NASA and the intelligence community have satellite cameras pointed everywhere in the sky. Probably not a cubic yard of the atmosphere that's not monitored. So we know that they can't help but detect all these UFOs or UAPs. Now, I say UAPs because of an old editing rule that if the last word of an initialism has an irregular plural, that doesn't matter. You still add an S to the end of the initialism. So even though the plural of phenomenon is phenomena, the plural of UAP would still be UAPs. But here I am going on and on about peculiar space debris. But that's not generally what people think of when they think of NHI vehicles. Of course, they think about the silver discs or the flying saucers. And now our source is going to move on to talk about NHI objects that we see zipping around in our atmosphere with our own two eyes.
The classic flying discs and crescents have the greatest presence in popular culture, but they are not the most common object. The most commonly seen objects are large reflective orbs, or pills, that move at high speeds. Usually, they are only seen for a second, but on other occasions, they follow aircraft, hover over sensitive locations, move in strange, illogical ways, and even suddenly disappear.
These orbs and pills are exactly what the two Navy pilots testified to Congress about in 2024. These Navy pilots see the orbs all the time because the orbs are following nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Anything that has nuclear power is apparently monitored closely by NHI, including our nuclear submarines. Yes, the Defense Department and NASA have another initialism, USO, unidentified submerged objects. And USOs have been tracked by underwater sonar as traveling hundreds of miles an hour under the water, which, of course, any engineer, anyone who knows physics, is conventionally impossible. And so these orbs and pills are everywhere. The silver orbs were especially prominent in December of 2024, all over England, but also New Jersey. Of course, we all remember that. More about that later. And Central Texas, even. There's a man in LA who has automated cameras that monitor air traffic over the city. And he showed some journalists that anytime a plane flies above around 10,000 feet, and he showed a journalist freeze-framed photographic evidence of silver orbs following airplanes anytime they fly above around 10,000 feet. And these planes include police helicopters, Air Force One, and of course military airplanes. Sometimes we have video of our military aircraft appearing to pursue NHI orbs, and sometimes it appears that the orbs are following our military assets. Now, some people think that these orbs are built exclusively by people. They claim that the United States has an arsenal of these silver orbs that can float in midair for hours, travel at 15,000 miles an hour without a sonic boom, make right-angle turns while traveling the speed of a bullet. But I have my doubts. I suspect that this electrogravitic technology that allows objects to travel like this wasn't developed by humans until the late 1990s, and I'm not sure that you can keep such a groundbreaking technology secret for almost 100 years. And I talk about the technology being hidden for that long because of the story of the Foo Fighters. And I don't mean the 1990s post-grunge band. I'm talking about these little glowing orbs that American pilots reported all the time during World War II. During bombing raids, B-17 pilots would see them following their airplanes out their windows. There's a brief glimpse of these in Oppenheimer. At the very last scene when Hans Zimmer's music is building and we're getting glimpses inside of Oppenheimer's mind while Albert Einstein is walking away from him across the grass. He's imagining the world slowly catching on fire. There is a moment where you see him inside of what looks like a military airplane looking out a window, and he's seeing these glowing orbs. I wonder if that's a reference to the Foo Fighters. But there are all sorts of military documents about this. There are other objects called ghost rockets that Army intelligence was looking for. So human technology has a long history of being tracked by somebody. Now our source touches on the kind of objects that people were seeing in New Jersey in December of last year. There's a big debate about who made these, where did they come from, what were they doing, but here's a description, and I'm sure that this will sound familiar.
At night, these orbs sometimes emit orange light, although other colors can also be seen. These objects have been submerging into the ocean as well as other bodies of water.
What puzzles me about some of this is the brazenness of it. If this is supposed to be top secret technology, and if they have cloaking devices that can make them very difficult to see with the naked eye, if they can travel so fast that you would have to slow down a high-speed video in order to see one frame of them flickering by. If they are capable of all this, then why do we see them so much? Why do they just sit off the coast of Miami and let people record it for minutes at a time before zipping off? If you want electrogravitic propulsion to stay a secret, how about not have these basketball to dumpster-sized silver orbs that float around with no heat? They don't make a sound. They fly off at supersonic speeds with no wind, no sonic boom. And how about, if you want to keep it secret, don't have dozens and dozens of them flying around in a single night like we had in New Jersey in December of 2024. I don't know if any of you remember that flap, but it was pretty extreme. For 3 days in a row, I saw very strange things over Austin, over my house. I did see one of those New Jersey drones, and I have a definite theory about what those were, and I believe we'll see objects like that again in the future. And yes, I did actually see an orb spawn another orb during that time. And I saw one of those dumpster-sized drones that was not an orb and had some airplane-like features, like FAA strobes and conventional-looking lights. But more about that later. Now, moving on to the ETs themselves and what they look like. Now, I myself have never actually seen any kind of alien or NHI. At least not that I remember. I may have been neuralized at some point. But now we're moving on to the appearance and external anatomy of the Greys. The source I'm quoting claims to have reviewed data collected on biological materials and what was known about the detained NHI, and they prepared a summary. In this next clip, he talks about the external appearance of the Greys in particular.
In regards to the appearance of the ETs, UFO mythology is dead on. Generally, they look like diminutive humanoids with large heads, reduced facial features, and very large eyes, which are sometimes covered in a transparent black film. Earlier specimens do not have the film. Later specimens do.
Well, that does perfectly describe what people see all the time. This leak was only the second time that I had heard about the black film. I had definitely seen mention of aliens that just had very large eyes that looked like humans but weren't completely black. So I had seen this two different types of eyes before, and according to this leaker, it's because it's some sort of film that's applied or sprayed on or just somehow develops while they're being born or printed or built or whatever the heck. And this is another strange situation where the NHI technology seems to change. If something can cross interstellar space and if it's been zipping around the Earth for thousands of years, then, why would they suddenly decide that they need to wear sunglasses? It's strange to see their technology change within a few decades. The timescale just seems to be a little off. The fact that the NHI are mostly very small, with some few types that are extremely tall, has been part of ufology forever. In 1989, when Bob Lazar came out about working at Area 51 in the early 80s, he himself never saw any NHI beings. He was strictly there to work on certain parts of one particular disc that had been recovered, what they were calling the sport model. Bob Lazar said that the interior was so small that he could only stand up straight right in the very middle of the disc. When he moved toward the edges where the little seats were for the pilots, he said it was like being in a preschool classroom with little chairs for what they called the kids. Bob Lazar said that he had heard Defense Department people referring to, quote-unquote, the kids. And of course, this leads me back to Skinny Bob. All roads lead back to Skinny Bob. Bob is maybe the best footage of an NHI Grey that we have. So all you have to do is get on YouTube and type in Skinny Bob, SKINNYBOB. You'll see what looks like a VHS camcorder in the 90s pointed at a screen on which is being projected a black and white film from the early 1960s that was supposedly taken in the Soviet Union. And this person was able to get a recording of the film being played in Russia and was able to get that video out of the country shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed. And there was a brief moment where a lot of intelligence leaked that the KGB had been sitting on for a long time. And Skinny Bob was one of those. Now, of course, the Skinny Bob footage wasn't released until the 2000s. So, could he be CGI? Sure. It's very well done. Definitely not AI, because Skinny Bob came out before anything remotely like that was available, even to the deep state. But all of this stuff could be CGI and AI. I think we're past the point where that's even a major consideration, because, let me put it this way, I could easily be an AI personality. Everything I say could be written by ChatGPT at this point. So it feels strange for someone who could easily be an AI to be trying to convince you that I'm not talking about things that are also produced by AI. We're in a giant AI maelstrom that is transforming what we know to be real. So at some point you have to pick your poison and go with what looks like the preponderance of evidence. Would I bet my life that Skinny Bob is real? No. But it's pretty convincing. Okay, so enough about those eyes. Let's talk about those long, spindly arms and legs. What's going on with that? What does our leaker say about them?
They have 2 long arms and 2 legs. They have 3 long fingers and an opposable thumb. They have feet with 4 toes. They may have fingernails and toenails, but not always. When they do, they are mottled and dark.
Like any child, I've always been fascinated with exactly how many fingers and toes do aliens have. So I've always seen mention of these 3 fingers and a thumb, but also sometimes 4 fingers and a thumb. And apparently this is just a variation that occurs among them. And I'm wondering whether this is because of digits fusing due to atrophy of the limbs over time. And I don't mean that these digits will fuse during their development or childhood. I'm not even sure if they have that, but it may be just a quirk of using boiled down genetics that are focused on creating a certain kind of brain, when you know that the body involved won't really have to do anything with its hands. And this is definitely something that's reported all the time, that the NHI don't use their hands much due to the what I call born with Bluetooth, which is a feature that the deep state discovered about our creepy friends. They've got a couple of tricks up their sleeve, well, in their giant brains. And now we move on to a delicate subject. It's a detail that I always thought was a little weird, and it challenged my credulity about this kind of thing. And that is their clothing. I know, I'm being careful. It's just very 1960s, The Jetsons or Star Trek. But I won't comment any further. Let's just listen. And we listen, and we do not judge. So let's just listen. We listen, and we do not judge.
They wear clothing, usually in the form of a very thin blue or gray high-collared garment, as well as boots.
And that sounds completely reasonable. In fact, I think humans should start wearing the exact same thing, if we want to be cool and all. I've also seen them wear white, black, or silver jumpsuits and boots. The fabric is apparently very thin, very soft, and very flexible, but nearly indestructible, so it's not cotton or polyester. Given these variations in their eye construction, their number of fingers, their skull shapes, their clothing, given all that, it doesn't appear that these are just cookie-cutter clones that are just stamped out. In fact, in the abduction literature, people always report being able to tell individual greys apart, and not entirely by appearance, just by their vibe, by the feeling that they get when they telepathically connect with them. You know, if you think about people you know, if you were able to sort of overlap with their consciousness, you wouldn't actually have to say anything to know that you're connected with that person. There's just a particular vibe and identity that you would detect. And abductees talk about this phenomenon a lot. So it's clear that they're just not stamped out like the clones in Star Wars, but they don't entirely seem to procreate and grow up the old-fashioned way. So what's going on there? Let's see if our leaker can shed any light on this.
Reproduction doesn't take place biologically. Instead, they are artificially created, with each one designed for a specific purpose as their society has need.
So this sounds a lot like Zack Snyder's version of Superman. In Man of Steel, they make it clear that the Kryptonians are born with a life plan sort of engraved on their DNA, that each Kryptonian has a genetically defined purpose. And for example, General Zod was born to be a military leader. The only passion that he was ever allowed in life at a biochemical level was the defense of Krypton. And so the gift that Superman's parents gave him was to remove the genetic engraving so that his destiny wasn't clear, so that Superman, wherever they sent him, could define his own purpose in life. And apparently the NHI are like Kryptonians. They're born to be a scientist, born to be a this, born to be a that, and that's what they do for their allotted period of time, and then they resign themselves to a calm death, apparently. Our leaker here suggests that maybe one of the purposes that these forms take is just to assume a form that humans could tolerate or accept or possibly communicate with. This is suggesting that their true form is completely immaterial, or that these are quasi-biological drones that are being stamped out by some electronic extraterrestrial AI that crashed into the Pacific 10,000 years ago. Who knows? But here he is wondering whether they have been tinkered with to make them more palatable to our eyes and ears, to make them a little less gross and weird so that we wouldn't be quite as upset when we had to deal with them.
The striking similarities between their anatomy and human anatomy leads me to wild speculation about whether the individuals we see are specifically designed to resemble humans in order to facilitate interaction.
I never found this to be super convincing, because why wouldn't they choose a better form? Why wouldn't they find something more pleasant or more durable? You would think that if they were going to go that route, they would just monitor our media and then show up looking like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, or Zendaya and Tom Holland. People would have no problem talking to them then. Instead, they went for the delicate and creepy look, something like the trashy heroin chic of the 90s. Skinny Bob definitely has that emaciated supermodel look, very aloof, making sure he's not smiling. Delicate and creepy is not a good look when you're trying to ingratiate yourself to people, especially for a guy. I mean, I tried the delicate and creepy look when I was younger, when I was dating. So I tried to go for the thinnest arms and legs possible, enormous bald head with weird protrusions, black film over my gigantic eyes, super tight jumpsuit, very cool little black boots. But that method didn't work. That form is not pleasing to the human female, it turns out. So I don't think that the appearance of the NHI is entirely chosen. They seem to be some kind of weird transitional compromise between something like us and something that is entirely dependent on their technology. Even their skin is apparently not all real skin. It's a papery, sprayed-on covering, probably to help protect their skin from our atmosphere. The few people who describe touching their skin report a strangely cool, dry feeling. They're not seen as moist or slimy, although they do sweat, and we'll cover more of that later. Alien sweat is a very niche subject, but I've studied it extensively. Alien sweat is gross because it contains a lot of ammonia, because they secrete their metabolic waste through their sweat. I mean, there's not a whole lot of options left when you don't have any reproductive organs or an anus, and so their metabolic waste is dissolved in ammonia and then just slowly excreted through their skin, similar to how we would sweat. And as we covered earlier, they don't eat solid food, and so they don't have real intestines. So their stomach essentially connects directly to an organ that's some kind of cross between a liver and a kidney. And the microbiologist Sis refers to this organ as a hepatorenal organ. Hepatorenal. It's a combination of the function of the liver and the kidney. And the tiny bit of waste that is filtered out gets dissolved in this ammonia-based compound and then excreted. These things also apparently have almost no immune system, so earthbound microbes will start to grow everywhere inside them. So we're clearly not dealing with things that are really designed to live on Earth for a long time. And so if they've been here for thousands of years, then why do they have to have this material sprayed on them to keep the air from hurting their skin? So the little grays and the beings that are like Skinny Bob are always very delicate and temporary seeming. They seem a little delicate even for living underground on Earth for long periods of time. Seems unlikely. They seem to be very ephemeral, disposable, more like things that are 3D printed than raised and nurtured from a child. Note that this is different from the beings that are called the tall whites, or the Nordics. They apparently live for thousands of years, have a great immune system, can live out in the desert on their own without being devoured by microbes, and so the Greys are a little different from them. Some people claim that the Greys are generic drones that do the grunt work of all the other NHI factions, like the Tall Whites or the Mantids. The Mantids are also very large, and they're more insect-like. And a lot of people have claimed to see Tall Whites and Mantids among groups of Greys, and it appeared that the Greys are sort of just the beings that do the work for other beings that are older, more organic, and more like us. It's just that we can't make these quasi-biological probes of ourselves and send them light years away to do our work. At least not yet. Give me another decade on that. I'm working on it. So now let's move on to the Greys' brains, which is their connection to their technology. The Deep State collected some biological material from Roswell in 1947. At that point, they may also have recovered material from the 1933 UFO crash in northern Italy that we just recently found out about. Overall, it appears that the Deep State and the Defense Department and the Air Force were all very disappointed with the material that was recovered. Sure, it was exciting. The materials were clearly exotic, extremely light, indestructible by our standards. But no flashing lights, no lasers, no buttons, no touch screens. Very much not like Star Trek or Star Wars. So how are they operating this stuff? I mean, not only do they not have buttons and touch screens, these things have these long, almost useless fingers with these thick, ugly fingernails. So what gives? So when the Deep State interacted with these beings for the first time in the late 1940s and early 1950s, they discovered something mind-blowing. The woo factor intruded. They found out that the Greys were telepathic. These beings couldn't talk. They didn't have functional mouths the way we do. They communicated by plugging thoughts directly into a person's mind. And they could read our thoughts, just like thumbing through a book. And so you can imagine why the deep state was shocked, terrified, and put on red alert. It turns out that if telepathy is real, then it must stay a heavily guarded state secret. And so telepathy and manipulation of consciousness was filed away right with nuclear power in terms of strange technologies that could get us in a lot of trouble. And so note that the deep state had multiple reasons to be very concerned about this. The fact of telepathy being real causes a major problem for people who are involved in espionage, for people who are concerned with what powers the Soviets may have, what they may have discovered. But the deep state had another urgent concern. They were realizing that psionic research was required in order to activate the NHI technology. The human engineers of the 1950s through the 1980s were very frustrated with their lack of any ability to control the NHI technology. And as we'll see, when the deep state gets scared and frustrated, bad things tend to happen, and a lot of money gets spent. But first, let's listen to what the deep state engineers discovered when they examined the materials recovered from NHI crashes.
There are no control panels or any kind of obvious mechanism for controlling the craft. Tools retrieved from crafts would be responsive to the touch and intention of the ETs, but would be totally inert in the hands of human operators. In interviews with subjects, they demonstrated the ability to communicate with and detect the presence of others of their kind in the same facility, in different rooms.
So this was the real bombshell of Roswell. This is what shocked the deep state. After all, I think by 1947, humans were culturally and technologically prepared for the idea of beings that could build devices that could defy gravity or inertia, fly from one planet to another, go faster than the speed of sound. These were ideas that the deep state was prepared to deal with. But then when they started hearing voices in their head, things always change. Everything's hunky-dory until you start hearing voices in your head. And then this psionic stuff, this telepathy and telekinesis stuff is shocking and hard to believe. If you work for the CIA and you're supposed to keep us safe from these alien things, then it doesn't help you sleep at night to know that these same beings can control objects with their minds. It does not help you sleep at night to know that they can just sync their brains with us anytime they want. Slip ideas in there, take ideas out, at will. Also, our intelligence community knew with certainty that the Soviets had recovered some NHI materials of their own. So, if psychic powers are real, what if the Soviets got help or some kind of advantage over us in the psychic arms race? What makes all this paranoia worse is that in 1952, the intelligence community was also shocked by the Soviets detonating a test thermonuclear fusion bomb. If the Soviets were inching ahead of us in nuclear weapons and in the space race, why not assume they're beating us in the NHI reverse engineering race? This all set the scene for CIA Director Allen Dulles to launch the MK Ultra program on April 13th, 1953. And I'm sure this is just a coincidence, but Allen Dulles just so happens to be a member of the Majestic 12, one of literally only 12 people who worked with President Eisenhower to communicate with and negotiate with the NHI. So, looking at the context here, this is 1 year after Majestic 12 is formed in 1952, which formed as possibly the result of a UFO swarm over Washington, D.C. in 1952 that was more extreme than what happened in New Jersey in 2024. And yes, there's tons of newspaper articles and photographs. It's just one of those weird things that people didn't know what to make of, and so they just kind of stopped talking about it. Just like they will eventually about the 2024 incident, although I think that we're going to see another incident like that soon. Soon as in within the next few years. And what do you know, also in 1952, the Air Force starts Project Blue Book to investigate the danger of UFOs. And then in 1953, MK Ultra starts. But I'm sure this is all just a coincidence and I'm overthinking things. I mean, after all, in 1952, the Soviets had just detonated their first fusion bomb. So of course it makes sense that in 1953, the CIA would start to spend billions of dollars on investigating psychic powers. Seems strange. Then, in 1954, according to ufology, the Treaty of Greada is signed. Greada, Treaty of Greada. Now, apparently, this was the agreement between Eisenhower and the Majestic 12 and one faction of Greys who agreed to help humans reverse engineer the recovered materials in exchange for allowing abductions to occur. And so note how political this is. It's very strange because people have noticed that abductions are very much a regional phenomenon or a nationalist phenomenon. People of certain nationalities get abducted. People of others tend not to. And a lot of people were thinking, well, why would aliens know or care what nationality you are? Well, maybe it's because they follow agreements. And it always creeped me out one time when Whitley Strieber was being probed. I don't know if it was a needle in the eye or some other uncomfortable process. And he yells out to them, you don't have the right to do this. And one of the Greys, quote unquote, told him, as in voice in his head, said, yes, we do have the right. And that always just creeped me out because how did they figure that out? Well, some people say, basically they're saying, look, old man Eisenhower told us we could do this to you people. I don't know how much I believe that, but if that's how aliens think about our politics, and if they think that we revere our leaders that way, then we're in big trouble. Now, how do the NHI perform these tasks? Is it all just electronic? Looking at the totality of everything I've read, it doesn't seem to be as simple as a Neuralink type implant. And there's nothing more foundational to ufology than the idea that the NHI understand consciousness on a level that we don't, and they have the ability to manipulate it. They almost have a kind of consciousness technology. Now, when we see this, we think that there's something involving electronics or radio waves going on because, that's how we send information from one place to another. And as far as we know, things that involve consciousness are mostly trapped inside our own minds, and we can't extend that consciousness somewhere else. But according to the NHI themselves, consciousness is a real thing. It's a field that permeates the universe, the psionic field, and we'll talk a lot more about that in Volume 3. The way they see it, living things like us experience consciousness when the brain reaches a certain level of complexity where it can interact with or tune into the psionic field. Similar to how certain proteins in the cells of our retinas allow us to perceive and interact with the electromagnetic field, i.e. light in our case. So apparently there's some sort of arrangement of neurons. There's some sort of biological processes that can draw on, interact with, detect, manipulate this psionic field. And that's the whole trick, apparently. And apparently, consciousness and this psionic field is a non-local phenomenon, meaning time and space don't connect directly to it. So things that happen in the psionic field are independent of what we would call time and place. So a message or a signal sent through the electromagnetic field can only travel the speed of light, and it would take 4 years just to get to the nearest star. But a message sent through the psionic field can cross interstellar space instantaneously. Now, the big disadvantage there is that only certain living beings can detect the psionic field. So you can't build a machine that can send psionic messages or receive them. because that's something that can only be experienced consciously by conscious beings, apparently. And so that is how the NHI communicate over long distances. Radio waves are way too slow. So it appears that this lattice is not some sort of radio transmitting device that just beams data from one brain to another. It is a real kind of telepathy. It's something that we would call psychic powers or something, psionic. That's another term that's been put out there. And note that they can communicate with us, and we don't have these special implants. And they have told people that humans have these rudimentary abilities, and that they are just much better at it because they understand the spiritual physics involved, I guess you could say, and they have technology that is adapted toward helping them interact with the psionic field. So apparently we have a long way to go. Here's more about those implants.
Before, I mentioned an artificial lattice, which is integrated into the nervous system. This lattice is at the heart of their technology. It is probably what makes these abilities possible. It's made of ordinary elements like copper and aluminum, and there is no discernible reason why it should be able to do what it seems to do.
So earlier I used the phrase born with Bluetooth. And there is a physical difference in their nervous system, apparently, that we don't understand. And we'll talk more about the woo factor and psionics a lot more in Volume 3. But we had to get the telepathy stuff out of the way so we can start talking about the interviews. So let's let our leaker start us off.
Because of my past work experience, most of my work on the report was related to actual interviews that had taken place with the ETs. Reading these was very surreal, and I suspect that the context of these interviews is part of the reason for so much secrecy. They were retrieved from crashes, but also from landings, where the craft seemed to have landed on purpose, and the beings came voluntarily. They were separated from their craft permanently so that their craft could be auctioned off. So the program had complete control of the interview process. The ETs have a very close relationship with their technology. They cannot survive for very long while separated from their craft and from each other.
Well, we can already start to see the reasons why no one wants this information to go public. We've got some of the worst qualities of humanity on display here. Cruelty, short-sightedness, paranoia, and most of all, greed. And let's continue.
The extraterrestrials are separated from their craft over long periods, which causes them to suffer. They can't eat anything other than a special kind of liquid food, and human-made substitutes were not sufficient replacements. Throughout their stay on Earth, they would suffer from malnutrition and a kind of toxic buildup in the body.
So unfortunately, they would begin to die the minute they were removed from their ship for an extended period of time. This is not the first time that ufologists have heard about the brown fluid. Apparently, they tried very hard to find a substitute for it in the 1950s, but they weren't able, and so their alien captives more or less starved to death. And of course, their deaths were hastened by massive infections because they have terrible immune systems. Let's continue.
Because of this separation, the ETs would slowly die. Because of how valuable they were, every effort was taken to keep them alive and conscious, even against their wishes. The situation reminded me of the case of Hisashi Ouchi.
Hisashi Ouchi was a Japanese technician at a nuclear power plant. He was involved in an accident that involved preparing fuel for the reactor, and he was exposed to a fuel mix that was far more radioactive than it was supposed to be, and so he received the single largest dose of radiation of any human known up to that point. And so medical researchers were very fascinated with using this as an opportunity to develop treatments for radiation sickness and see just what happens to a body when most of its DNA has been completely pulverized. And that is essentially the primary danger of radiation, is that it damages and destroys DNA in cells. And organisms have evolved to be totally fine with a low level of radiation exposure. We have all kinds of automatic gene repair methods in our cells, but a massive blast like Hisashi Ouchi suffered will completely demolish their DNA so that their bodies can't produce new material to replace anything. And that's why the effects can be so terrible, where the person seems to be sort of liquefying and they lose their ability to produce, hair, skin, blood, that kind of thing. Since we're talking about their disposability and frailty, let me pause to reiterate that we're talking about the grays, the little giant black-eyed things, and they are the most commonly seen NHI, and we seem to have the closest relationship with them. Not necessarily a positive relationship, though. But I wanted to make sure and mention also that the tall whites exist, supposedly. And again, they are much more robustly biological, like us, and they can live for longer than we can, even on Earth. But bear in mind that all NHI are apparently telepathic. Discovering the psionic field appears to be a typical milestone in the development of civilization. So you have agricultural revolutions, industrial revolutions, information revolutions, and then at some point, electrogravitics, AI. But the technological discovery that seems to blow the lid off everything and transform civilizations is the discovery of technological ways to manipulate the psionic field. So let's hear more detail about how these interviews took place.
Communication took place through telepathy. They can read our thoughts and send the thoughts and impressions into our minds. However, this takes a lot of concentration on the part of the interviewer, and communication would break down as the health and consciousness of the subject declined. The interviewer and the ET would communicate telepathically. Then the interviewer would say the exchange out loud for it to be recorded.
Now, allow me to reiterate that this is very strange, but the telepathy claim is one of those bizarre but absolutely consistent themes in ufology. Abductees report this universally. And strangely, now we have government people talking about the same communication method. Now, to give you just one of thousands of examples of telepathy being used during abduction accounts, here is a quote from Barney Hill, who was abducted along with his wife in 1961. And here he is describing how one of the beings communicated with him.
I did not hear an actual voice, but in my mind, I knew what he was saying. It wasn't as if he were talking to me with my eyes open and he was sitting across the room from me. It was more as if the words were there, a part of me, and he was outside the actual creation of the words themselves.
So what did we learn today? Nothing, really. Nothing for sure. Except maybe there is a secret world that only a few hundred humans know about, and they're keeping that knowledge all to themselves, at great expense to everyone. Their biggest advantage is that the truth sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. And there's another sort of emotional problem I have with all this UFO stuff. There's a big mismatch here between, on one hand, the enormous stakes involved. We're talking about the more or less surrender of humankind to a quiet occupation, where we have these waves of experiments performed on us, and then we're just sort of neurologically made to forget about them. We're like a herd of cattle on a research farm. Then, to counterbalance these enormous stakes and these mankind making or breaking type developments, you have aerospace industry executives who have knowledge about the program. In other words, there are people who build airplanes for a living, which is awesome. That's a great job to have. We should have super smart people building super cool airplanes all the time. These are people who also have monumentally important information about the universe and our place in it. And they have the ability, and they make the choice, to hide this information from the people whose job it is to investigate the universe. And so there's the problem. I'd like to have a society where the people who build airplanes know all kinds of important things and make good airplanes. And then I want a society where the people whose job it is to investigate the universe get the information that they're supposed to have so that we can make sense of things. But right now, there's clearly artificial bulkheads or barriers of knowledge that have been forcefully wedged into society to keep all the dots unconnected, so to speak. So, what's coming up in Volume 3? All right, well, so here's the deal. Volume 3 is where I'm going to lose all of you. I'll try to keep going, but Volume 3 is going to be a doozy. That's going to be about NHI society and religion. Yes, they have a religion. And we'll talk about all sorts of things, like whether they believe in God. It appears that they know for certain that there is an afterlife because they have a complete lack of fear of death, which humans find unsettling. I certainly find it unsettling because I've seen that their lack of a fear of death means that they don't take our death all that seriously either. They react to our fear of death the way a parent reacts to a baby throwing a tantrum when it has to take a bit of medicine. And their religion is central to why they're here on Earth. And so I'll leave you with this. We just heard Barney Hill say that the NHI's communication feels like, quote, "the words were there, a part of me." Well, more than one person, when they asked the NHI about their purpose here on Earth, the word that these officers felt in their heads, the word they felt was part of them, was apotheosis. Apotheosis. And apotheosis is, wouldn't you know it, an ancient Greek word. It means the act of making something like God, of creating something divine. As in, you could say, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey is the apotheosis of film. It can also mean the act of becoming God, whatever that means. Hopefully we'll be able to make some sense of this in the next episode. There's one thing for sure. Along the way, we will learn exactly where consciousness comes from. Talk to you next time.